Welcome to the EdRed podcast, hosted by Bridget Peach and Arabette Hernandez of EdRed. This is episode 3, part 2 to Give Me the Deets on EBF, featuring Brian Battle and Bob Spatz. Join us as we continue the discussion on the importance of continuing the work on EBF and thoughts on how it can be improved.
Once you got to that final stage where you got the legislators involved, then there were different adjustments and negotiations to fine-tune the formula so that it had certain desired effects of certain legislators. That's where certainly you had to be flexible. And Bob, I know you remember all this stuff too. And I think Bob and I were both in a position of saying, look, we kind of created something that we thought was pretty good, pretty pure. But you can't, it's more important to get something passed. So that's where there's always in that final legislative process, you're going to have some things that are going to change, that it's going to impact certain districts more than others, but it's more important to get it passed.
Right. Yeah. Certainly one of the big changes that impacted, Oak Park was the implementation of the real receipts, because Oak Park, relatively speaking, has a high tax rate for its education, doesn't have that high of VAB because there's not a lot of commercial property. And so the calculation without real receipts for Oak Park puts us in tier 2, both the elementary and the high school district. And at that point, the high school district had, I think, over $100 million fund balance, had been written up a few places, and people were saying, wait, they can't be considered a tier 2 district. We have to figure out some way to do it. And that was sort of where the trade-off was made, to put in real receipts and put in that property tax relief grant. Is part of the idea of the property tax relief grant was also to say, well, for districts that are taxing above what they're required to, perhaps we can provide some property tax relief. But that's one that's going to need to be tweaked over time as things get closer and closer to adequacy. There are some districts that are getting to adequacy without having to exceed their local capacity percent, whereas some have that locked in. And that, again, is one that, as the funding comes closer to adequate, is going to need to be looked at. Perhaps it's just more property tax relief grants or something along that line, and some of the money shifted. One of the other things was, what should the target be in terms of how much funding should go into it? And when it was originally passed, the target was they would reach full funding in 10 years, 2027. They are not on track to do that. The Center for Tax and Budget Accountability has a couple reports out about that they calculate at the current rate of things, it will either be 2034 or it will take $850 million to 2027. And 850 is very unlikely. So it'll probably be somewhere between those, 2027 and 2034, but hopefully they won't slide beyond 2034. But that's an important one to keep in mind, because that was something that really is a political decision, not a modeling decision of how much new money to put into the EBF. The EBF says, here's how much it takes to get to adequacy. We were under no illusions or delusions that we would, that the state would suddenly come up with, I think at the time, $6 billion more and get to adequacy in 1 year. But, how to get from here to there, just like with the pension debt and a few other things, the ramp is all important. Do you do it level? Do you put more investment early? One of the early numbers that I pulled out is when in the first year there were 146 districts that were below 60% adequacy, and 2 were in fact below 50% adequacy. In the last year, there were only 2 districts below 60%. So it's really brought up the bottom, hasn't gotten as many people to 90% as would be ideal. But again, it was designed to put more money into bringing people up from the bottom than to just get more people over the line from either 85 to 95 or 95 to 100. That you could have designed something so that you got more districts adequately funded, but left more further behind. And that's always the issue. Anytime you're prioritizing, are you trying to move the distribution or move the people closest to the target line? You know, you can do that with test scores. You take all the people who are right at the cut score and give them extra tutoring and just let the other people fall further behind, or do you invest across the whole spectrum of districts, putting your most resources in the ones that are furthest behind? And that was the design of this.
Do you guys know, have the state moved the line that defines tier 1 and tier 2?
That dynamically changes. The line between that.
Do you know where it is now?
I don't know where it is right now, but it was designed to dynamically change because
it was. Right.
Yeah.
So as the number of school districts moved up, that line adjusted to.
You're still trying to kind of, yes. So like, for instance, it was designed, right? A certain amount of money goes to tier 1, a certain money goes to tier 2. For instance, if you were only left with 2 schools in tier 1, they'd get a lot of money. So the idea is, as you're moving everybody closer to adequacy, you still need to adjust that line between tier 1 and tier 2. So there's a critical mass of schools that still need more money, and then you get the tier 2 dollars too.
Right. We spent a long time working with Ben Bohr at Advance Illinois on what that calculation should be, and it is dynamic, and I am not finding it quickly as to what it is right now, but it has certainly moved up, and again was designed so that it would move over time, whereas the tier 3 cutoff at 90% and the tier 4 cutoff at 100% were fixed and are constants. The tier 1 to tier 2 breakpoint is a calculation that is done annually. And in fact, that's part of the reason why it is a little difficult to say how many compare tier 1 districts 5 years ago versus tier 1 districts now, because you're measuring against a different thing. Take a look at Center for Tax and Budget Accountability has something about where the money went and where people are in different tiers. And they have like a 20-page report that we probably can make a link available at some point, but that, helps break that out. And one of the big things is CPS switch from tier 1 to tier 2, which is good news. But then the number of students in tier 1 radically dropped because you had
a big lump,
300 and something thousand kids going from tier 1 to tier 2. And so they do their calculations with and without CPS included, just so you don't have that major change. But the good news is that, CPS is out of tier 1.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like with those 2 that if you round up are at 60%, right? The 145-ish school districts that we had originally calculated were below 60% have now all moved up. So the system is working as we hoped it would.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear what's next, what you all see as the next steps to, continuing the work that's been done. But I think something I'm taking away from this conversation is how not only schools evolve, but also the legislature. You mentioned at the beginning, Bob, that you had conversations of, yes, the legislature knows that schools need more funding, but there wasn't a confidence in the current model to make that funding possible. And so creating this new model, that was definitely an incentive of, we need to do something so we get this additional funding. And now in recent years, we saw, obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the legislature take a break from funding EBF.
Mhm.
And now there's this renewed push for not only being consistent in those payments, but also potentially increasing those payments so we can get back on track of reaching adequacy. So I think it's very interesting. I'd love for you both to finish this episode with your advice specifically for the EdRed directors, the legislators. What are your pieces of advice on continuing to move us forward in school funding? How can we do that and be more inclusive of special ed needs, of transportation, these costs that districts are facing that are outside of the formula? What do you see as our next steps?
Why don't you go first, Brian?
Okay. I think that the low incidence, kind of high impact special ed population is appropriately dealt with outside the adequacy formula, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not some additional funding sources that should be directly targeted to that population. I would always continue to fight for that. I think that it's harder for school board members in some communities to justify the high amount of spending on those students when you compare it to the general population. So I think for the state to provide that safety net is the right thing to do. Transportation, likewise, I think is still appropriately outside. With this goofy system we have in the state where we've got whatever it is, 12, 15 different types of school districts. Some have to provide free transportation, some don't. It gets to be a really hard number to standardize because you not only do you have that difference in in district types, but you've got differences in district size in terms of not only number of students but square feet, square miles, right? And so not all districts are the same. So I think coming up with a different way to manage transportation costs, that should be separate, I think, and outside too. The one area that I think I can't decide if it should be in the model or outside of some of the capital. When you look at capital needs, there's obviously just annual operations and maintenance stuff. The other end of the spectrum are big referendum campaigns where we're injecting community dollars into the building of new buildings, significant renovations. But there's a level in between that every school district has to deal with, which are capital projects that are $1 million, $2 million. And they're not the major capital, but they're not just your annual normal maintenance costs. Some districts have DSEB capability to be able to do that. That was such an arbitrary law, and it's not applied equitably. So it would seem to me that there's an opportunity for the state to provide, if not funding, a certain taxing authority similar to DSEB that can be utilized on a 2-3 year basis, that every school district has access to do kind of maintenance projects that may not be necessarily a referendum level project, but still you need to do it to keep your school facilities in good shape. And, Bridget, you were mentioning about some of the safety issues that are kind of right up front. And I know in 2020, we passed a major referendum, and a big part of it was to spend a significant amount of money on safety upgrades in our schools. And I think that in today's world, that is one of the things that parents, local elected officials, and really everybody in community has a concern about. And for the state to provide school districts to access some funding so that they can implement those, because the kind of safety needs you need in a school are not inexpensive. And so I think that the state needs to provide districts either with money or with a taxing authority to do those kind of projects. I don't think it belongs in the adequacy model, but I do think it's a school funding issue that I think could easily be addressed.
And for me, the three that come to mind are early childhood, and tied into capital is potentially school districts might need to build some capacity for that, as well as full day K, which now is going to be required 2027. Is that the year? And some schools have the capacity for it already, and some don't. Some are already doing it, some don't. So that is one where you need to look at. But particularly in 2021, Governor's Commission on Early Childhood Funding came out that used a lot of the same concepts of the evidence-based funding model, but only did the adequacy calculations, came out in 2021, and that showed that there was, between the state, parents, and federal, a $10 billion gap in spending for adequate early childhood across the state. That's a bigger number than the K-12 gap. Now, again, it wouldn't all necessarily have to come from the state, but that is going to be a big debate as things go on. And just in October, the governor announced that he's created a group to submit legislation this spring to create a unified early childhood agency. And that, I think, is going to impact school funding as well, just because ISB potentially is going to have some of its early childhood funding moved out of ISB into someplace else, as well as you try to reach adequacy for early childhood, the money has to come from someplace. And so that's going to be a major debate going on how to do that adequately and equitably. And on the capital expenditures, there potentially is a way to tie in the evidence-based funding model tier levels, or perhaps some other proxy for EAV capacity, to say districts in tier 3 and tier 4 can have issue some additional bonds to do some of the capital expenditures. But the reality is, for a lot of districts that don't have enough EAV, the issue isn't that, tax caps or referendum. There's simply not the taxing capacity to do it. And so trying to figure out an equitable way for the state to acknowledge the fact that they're underfunding operating, which means that many districts are, if you will, overtaxing to cover their operating expenses, which then give them less money for capital. And maybe they could accelerate this gain to adequacy, which would then free up some of those districts' money to then pay for capital, or perhaps there has to be some understanding that some of the capital funding, as it has at various points in time, come from the state. Oak Park Elementary District benefited from the Build Illinois program under Governor Ryan to the tune of about 20-25% of our middle school construction. They got about $17 million on a $70-80 million project that made it much, much more feasible to do and for the referendum to pass. So there is, and always has been, some contribution from the state in trying to figure out how to do that more equitably. I just remember Park benefited from the Build Illinois, but it was one of the most, in my mind, inequitable grant programs, because you had to show you had the money to do it without the grant money before you qualified for the grant. It's like, and so it was one of those weird situations. But part of the reason why they did that is they knew the money would run out, and some districts never got the money.
And I'm going to add one more thing.
Please.
You asked about outside the funding, but I think you guys at EdRed, other school advocacy groups, I think you have to treat our funding model as a living document. It needs periodic updating to reflect kind of the current challenges in education, because you want it to continue to do the right things, to prioritize money where it's needed. And it's important because remember where we started this conversation. There was a frustration, even with legislators, that the funding formula had gotten out of date and was ineffective. And that causes legislators to say, why should I throw more money at it? So it's important to keep this relevant by keeping the adequacy assumptions up to date, keeping all the data up to date, so that it's still doing what it's supposed to do. And then legislators hopefully will continue to feel comfortable funding it because they know they're funding the right outcomes.
Mhm.
Right. And I know we talked about even at the 5-year mark, I think going through a formal committee review.
When it comes to these changes in treating EBF, to use your verbiage, as a living document,
Mhm.
I do think that the PRP has fulfilled that role. I think they're doing a really good job
Good.
still safe keeping the integrity of what
Mhm.
the mission of EBF was.
Mhm.
And what we see so much in the legislature is some really good ideas, but the implementation backing isn't there. And so I think the PRP serves as a really good entity.
Good.
Right.
Keep it relevant.
Right. And
Keep it relevant.
just along that lines, in sort of 2021, middle of COVID and stuff, the two things that I know have come up that are part of the PRP's mission is looking at like support staff levels.
Mhm.
And given the mental health strains and various other things, is there a need to bump up the adequacy levels for mental health professionals in schools?
Right.
That was not really a topic at all in 2015 to 2017. In 2020 through 2024, you constantly hear about the need for more mental health professionals. So that's obviously another place to look at.
Last session, we saw a push for a statewide support staff minimum wage increase.
Mhm.
And one of the big pushes from Rep. Davis,
Mhm.
was this needs to go through the PRP because this is going to impact
Mhm.
the formula.
Right.
We can't
It
have this
will. Right.
conversation outside of PRP. So
Mhm.
there are a lot of great champions on this
Uh-huh.
issue that are still in the legislature, I think.
Good.
Educating the newer folks
Mhm.
on this, and that's part of the reason we're so happy
Mhm.
you guys joined us, is bringing this story forward in an accessible way. We have so many great members who they know what EBF stands for. They know that it's good, but kind of giving them that history is really valuable. So thank you both for joining us, and we will be in touch because there's always going to be funding issues that we're going to want to talk about, and we want to build upon that legacy you've created with EBF. So thank you both.
Thank you.